Hi, I'm Max Rudin, President and Publisher of Library of America, and welcome to this special edition of LOA Live. For those who don't know, Library of America is a nonprofit organization dedicated to publishing authoritative new volumes of great American writers and to keeping the many-voiced American literary tradition a vital part of our culture. We're grateful to our co-host this evening, the Center for American Studies at Columbia University. A special welcome to Library of America members and donors who support our mission. 6 decades ago, historian Richard Hofstadter explored the persistent strains of irrationality and conspiratorial thinking in American public life and their threat to democratic politics. How can Hofstadter help make sense of today for us when fringe conspiracy theories have moved into the political and media mainstream? That's one of the guiding questions for tonight's very distinguished panel. This event marks publication of Richard Hofstadter, Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, The Paranoid Style in American Politics, Uncollected Essays, 1956 to 65, volume 330 in the Library of America series, edited by Sean Wilentz, who joins us tonight. Now, to introduce our panel, please welcome the Director of Columbia's Center for American Studies, Professor Casey Blake.
Thank you, Max, and greetings to everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you all on behalf of the Center for American Studies at Columbia. Before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to thank the Library of America for co-sponsoring this event and also thank the Jack Miller Center for its financial support. The Center for American Studies offers courses and sponsors programs that bring historical knowledge and historical perspective to bear on issues of pressing public concern. Tonight, we have 4 distinguished scholars who are prepared to do exactly that by revisiting Richard Hofstadter's classic study of the paranoid style in American politics and his other great works from the 1960s in the age of Donald Trump. Sean Wilentz is the George Henry Davis 1886 Professor of American History at Princeton University. Arlie Hochschild is Professor Emerita of Sociology at the University of California at Berkeley. Eric Foner is DeWitt Clinton Professor Emeritus of History at Columbia. And we are fortunate to have as the moderator for tonight's discussion, Ira Katznelson, who is the Ruggles Professor of Political Science and History and also the interim provost at Columbia. So thanks to all the panelists for joining us. Thanks to those of you in the audience. And with that, I will turn things over to Ira Katznelson.
Thanks so much, Casey. It's great to be here. This book is a gem. It's a joy to reread familiar texts and new ones, some, as Max said, previously unpublished. Before turning to Sean, to whom we owe a special debt for editing this book, and to Arlie and Eric, please allow me to underscore how Richard Hofstadter articulated his own sense of how he defined and pursued his historical craft, especially matters of motivation, orientation, and what might be called a methodology of open history. Hofstadter, after all, was not a standard historian. All my books, he wrote in 1962, as he was completing Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, have been, in a certain sense, topical in their inspiration. That is to say, he continued, I have always begun with a concern with some present reality and have been led to see the past in light of current problems and controversies. And as he introduced the paranoid style in American politics in 1965, commenting on why, quote, so many of these pages deal with the contemporary right wing, he noted that this thematic prominence, quote, reflects a recurrent interest on my part in writing about the historical background of contemporary issues. In short, Hofstadter brandished history as a tool to intervene in and shift present-day understanding about matters of current dispute and significance. Orientation. Hofstadter was what might be called a historian of political dispositions. Quote, "While I have often been referred to as an intellectual historian or as a historian of ideas, I do not think of myself in this way. I think of myself as a political historian," and the italics political of his, whose chief contribution has been to try to tell what people thought they were doing in their political activity. That is, what they thought they were either conserving or reforming or constructing. And third, about his method. Hofstadter self-described as an analytical historian whose work, quote, was shaped by a very considerable interest in the fields adjacent to history, naming philosophy and criticism, economics, and political science. In short, he summarized, it attempts to develop and state new ways of looking at historical events. Since its task is analytical, he wrote, it tries to dispense with as much as possible as the apparatus of narrative history. I sacrifice historical detail. Increasingly, the last essay in the book concludes, my work has been dominated by this concept of analytical history, which he distinguished not only from the literary impulses of narration, which he designated as history as art, but from the focused and detailed monograph and its, quote, careful accumulation of detailed evidence, end quote. Finally, let me say in introducing to this event that what Hofstadter said about Tocqueville implicitly applied reflexively to himself. He underscored Tocqueville's engaged detachment, a perspective, quote, that accepted the historical necessity of the values he disliked, end quote. And it is to such values that Hofstadter's work on anti-intellectualism and the paranoid style was oriented. To that and more, let's now turn to Sean, to Arlie, to Eric. Sean.
Thank you, Ira. It's great to see you all, and thank you, Max, and it's just a wonderful occasion. And Ira, I especially appreciate what you said at the beginning about Hofstadter's style. That comes out of an essay that was unpublished, the very last essay in the book, and I ran across it in the Hofstadter papers up at Columbia. And it was the first time that I actually heard him describe what he thought he was doing, and how he was aligned with philosophy and criticism and so forth. So I was very happy to find that and be able to put it as the kind of capstone of this particular volume. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the background of the project, of the Hofstadter project, as it were, at the Library of America. Max Rudin had to put up with me for a while, always nudging him to include more historians in the Library of America. There were just too few historians there. I mean, we had Henry Adams, which is fine, and Francis Parkman. I guess people still read Francis Parkman today, but he's a fine literary. But, you know, there were too few historians. And history at its fullest is a literary art. And to exclude American historians, some extraordinary writers of American history, or Americans who wrote about history, really was selling short American literature writ large. So I was bugging Max to just, you know, include some historians here. And he finally took me up on it. He said, sure, which one? And I very quickly said Richard Hofstadter. In part because Hofstadter was a literary stylist of the first order. He took some grief for that, frankly, for some of the reasons that Ira mentioned. I mean, he didn't have the kind of heavy, leaden, archive-rich, dullness that many historians seem to prize in each other's work. He eschewed all of that. He didn't want to have anything to do with any of that. He didn't want to write that kind of book. Rather, he wanted to write, as Ira described, analytical history. History that was in touch with the present, but never, allowed the present to overwhelm the past. He wanted to understand what people thought about what they were doing, rather than necessarily deducing what we thought that they were doing. He was a historian of ideas and culture as much as anything else. But he wanted to render that in a form that displayed his literary skills, which were extraordinary. He was not going to be what he called an archive rat. He was going to be a person who made history come alive to present concerns in a way that was direct, but also illuminating in its prose. Now, you know, with the sense that his friend Alfred Kazin actually once described Hofstadter, and he said what he most appreciated about Hofstadter was his elegance of mind, that in an elegant mind. And I think that shows up in the prose as well. He had an elegance about him, as well as a pithiness about him, which was really quite extraordinary. And so I came upon Hofstadter right away as the literary exemplar for that reason. So what we planned was, as the Library of America tries to publish as much as it can of any of the authors that it chooses, is a multi-volume reproduction of Hofstadter's work. One volume that would start in 1938 with his very earliest essay, running through 1955, including the books, the Social Darwinism in American Thought, the American Political Tradition and the Age of Reform, plus essays. Then this volume, and then a final volume from 1966 on to the end of his tragic early death in 1970. The question is, why do we do this one first? Why do we're bringing them out of chronological order? And that reason was pretty simple, because, you know, we saw that this book was likely to come out in 2020, and that would be a good time to bring out Anti-Intellectualism in American Life and the Paranoid Style in American Politics. A little bit of setting for that. I mean, these were works, as Ira said, works of the 60s, but they reflected very much Hofstadter's turn in the 1950s. They reflect very much his reaction to McCarthyism, but also the defeat of Adlai Stevenson, for whom he worked very, very hard. In fact, he sort of got in trouble at Columbia for having worked so hard for Adlai Stevenson. They didn't think that was something that a professor ought to be doing. But this is very much Hofstadter's reflections on why American politics, American life was so bereft of intellectual engagement. Why it seemed in this age of intellectual mediocrity that was the Eisenhower era, but also coming off of McCarthyism, what was the problem in American life? What was there? And that was what the impetus, I think, for the anti-intellectualism in American life was all about. A rather sprawling work, but then followed up very quickly with Paranoid Style in American Politics. So these are Hofstadter's reflections on what went wrong with American politics in a way. And he was looking at it not from the standpoint of material interests or something like that. He was looking at political psychology, at how political culture operated. And that really is the heart of these two books and the heart of a lot of what he was writing about in the 1960s. He was particularly alarmed, and this is where Hofstadter's present involvement, he was particularly alarmed by the Goldwater candidacy in 1964. And I think that helps explain why he got so head up in the Paranoid Style. Anti-Intellectualism in American Life, we brought it out first. It's not my favorite, actually, of Hofstadter's books. On stylistic grounds alone. I mean, unlike, say, the American Political Tradition, which has a very clear thesis, a very clear argument, and argues it very pithily and very powerfully, Anti-Intellectualism is kind of a sprawling work. It kind of goes in no direction in particular. I think that he himself was dissatisfied with it by the time he finished writing it, but he was working out something very important, and that came out, I think, very powerfully in that essay, Paranoid Style in American Politics. And so it was Goldwater, above all, which was pushing a lot of that. The essay actually began as a lecture at Oxford, given, as I discovered too late, on November 21st, 1963, the night before the world changed. And he was already thinking about this. He'd been working on the right wing in American politics for a while. He actually given a radio lecture, which John Summers and others helped me get, and I was able to put it in the book. He was thinking about this as early as 1959, but it really crystallized with the rise of Goldwater in '64. And he was able to see and put passion into that particular volume, that particular essay, which I think rings out today. So in the world of time of not only Trump is bad enough, in the world of QAnon, I can't imagine Richard Hofstadter actually imagining QAnon. I can see him imagining Fox News. I can't quite see him imagining Twitter, because who could have? But QAnon, I mean, at one and the same time, it's the most bizarre, but it also recaptures some of the themes that he's talking about in the Paranoid Style essay. Some of the very themes, you know, drinking babies' blood and all of that. I mean, these are perennials in American political culture that have been reformed, recombined, permutated, recombined in all kinds of ways. So I think that, you know, here we are more than 50 years later, and here is this essay that speaks to us with a great deal of power even now. I don't think that very few historians could have written such a piece as well as he did. So that's why we brought it out now, and I hope that, you know, I hope you'll get a chance to read it. I hope it'll help you inform, help you understand that these things have a history, that it's not just born of the last 10, 15, 20 years, that there are themes in this moment that we're in that are not new, that do go back right to the American founding, as he writes in that essay, and that to understand where we are now requires us to see how it came out of those earlier manifestations. So that's what we did in this. That's what I hope we do in it. And Ira, I'll turn it back to you.
Much, Sean. And let's turn to Arlie.
Yes, well, thanks very much, Ira and Sean. You know, when I first read Hofstadter, especially his Paranoid Style, an American Politics piece, I was riveted. And what I think I've done in the last while is to kind of take Hofstadter into the field. I'm an ethnographer. I like to enter, you could say, alternate worlds. And in a way, in the Hofstadter tradition, to take a great interest in what people think they are doing, right? Not what I think they do, but listen to how they listen and what they tell themselves. And he's focusing on analytic history in a way that's what I've tried to do. In a recent project in 2011, just briefly, I set out from my little political bubble here in Berkeley, California, to an equal and opposite political bubble as the two sides were splitting. Even in 2011, one could see. And I went to the Deep South, to Louisiana, to study enthusiasts for the Tea Party. I spent 5 years getting to know people and going to meetings of Republican women of Southwest Louisiana and following conservative candidates as they whistle-stopped through the area and in other ways. And what I discovered is that there was a paranoid style, but that one had to understand in order to illuminate how it appeared to the people who carry this style. I first felt I had to understand what I came to call the deep story of the hard right, which is told as in a dream and a metaphor that you're waiting in line for the American dream, and you've waited a long time, line hasn't moved, and there are line cutters. Well, who are they? They're Blacks, they're women, they're public sector workers, environmentalists. And then another moment of this right-wing deep story, there's Barack Obama waving to the line cutters. Oh, so the government is now your enemy because it's helping people that are pushing you back in line. Okay, that's the other details, but that's the story. And as time has gone on, there are new chapters to this deep story, which I think reveal how paranoia enters in. one chapter is of this deep story is, oh, now we have Donald Trump. He will make others strangers in their own land, but we now will reown our land. We will move up in line. He is saving us. And then in another moment, another chapter as it's unfolded, is that he is suffering for us. Now let me pause to say that this paranoia, I think, we have to understand it as contained by a vehicle. And the vehicle is kind of a metaphor. And if we've always wondered how so many evangelicals could be extraordinary enthusiasts for such an unreligious man, I think we have a clue in the following way. If these chapters of this deep story keep going, Donald Trump is saying, I'm suffering for you. So a lot of secular liberals don't tune into this frequency, but this is how I think Trump accesses their paranoia. I suffer, Donald Trump says, for you. And then he says, I have many enemies. I have the treasonous mainstream press. I have the deep state. I have those who want to impeach me. I have enemies within the Republican Party. I have the Democratic machine, and they're spying on me. So many kind of moments of paranoia are seen as enemies of your rescue. So Trump is saying, I am you, everything I do is for you, and I am in danger of these suspect, powerful, malevolent forces. And then the next chapter is, so understand as I push the enemy back, and come with me in halting these malevolent forces that are getting in the way of me being your servant. And here's where the religion, and I would say belief in Christ and the resurrection, actually becomes the vehicle for that paranoia. By saying, I'm suffering for you, and okay, it's highly interpretive. This isn't, but that he's almost saying, I'm dying for you, and there will be a resurrection, through science. I mean, there's even a notion of himself going down for his followers, but his heroism and his claim to this high status in their belief system is based on fighting all the enemies. So I'll just give you that, but what I'm doing here is, as a field worker, working with his ideas and seeing if this is a way in which some of his ideas can be, I can't help illuminate our present system.
Thanks so much, Arlie. And let's turn now to Eric.
Yeah, well, thank you again to the Library of America. Thanks to Sean for producing this really fascinating volume, and the American Studies Center. Most of the discussion this evening, I think, will be about Hofstadter's writing, his scholarship. I wanted to begin with just a couple of remarks about him as a person and as a teacher. I worked for many years with Hofstadter. He supervised my undergraduate senior thesis at Columbia on the eminently forgettable subject, the racial attitudes of the Free Soil Party. I studied with him as a graduate student, and I was one of the last to complete a dissertation under his supervision. He couldn't attend my dissertation defense in 1969 because he was in the hospital He died in 1970 at the very young age of 54. I learned an enormous amount about history, writing, and what it is to be a scholar from Hofstadter. This is not because he was a great teacher. He was rather shy, actually, and he didn't like lecturing at all. I should add that this shyness went along with a remarkable modesty, not always seen in the academic world. I remember sitting in his office when he received a phone call. He hung up and said, "I've just been awarded the Pulitzer Prize for Anti-Intellectualism in American Life." So of course I said, "Oh, well, congratulations, that's great." His response was unusual for winners of the Pulitzer Prize. He said, "That book didn't deserve it." But then after a pause, he said, "However, my first one did, the first Pulitzer Prize, which was for the Age of Reform." But back to teaching. In the history department at that time was some brilliant lecturers, the witty and incisive William Leuchtenberg, the very thoughtful Eric McKittrick, the spellbinding Walter Metzger, and the legendary James P. Shenton, who was beloved by generations of undergraduates. But Hofstadter, as he once said to me, "I am a writer. I teach to earn a salary." Teaching was not his passion like some of those others. But he was at his best in small groups, in seminars, in individual consultations, and when criticizing written work. I well recall his seminar as a graduate student on the progressive historians around the time that he finished writing that book. Hofstadter remarked almost apologetically at the outset that studying Charles Beard, Frederick Jackson Turner, and Vernon Parrington must seem hopelessly arcane to us graduate students, but that each scholar must at some point try to come to terms with his or her formative influences. And each week in the seminar was a brilliant lesson in historical analysis. Hofstadter was shaken by the student upheaval of 1968 at Columbia, although he remained close to those of his graduate students who were involved. I should add that while, like most faculty, he was not sympathetic to the student uprising, unlike them, he treated his own participating students with respect. He met with us, trying to understand the grievances that had led to the crisis on the campus. He asked his students whether he should agree to give the commencement address in place of Columbia's discredited president, Grayson Kirk. Most of us said no. His presence would confer legitimacy on a bankrupt administration. He responded sort of wearily that he would probably do it, quote, "If I don't, someone much worse will." And when Hofstadter rose to speak, many of the graduating seniors departed for what was called a counter-commencement on the campus. Those who remained heard a short, very eloquent speech reaffirming the university as a place committed to, quote, "certain basic values of freedom, rationality, inquiry, and discussion." The study of history, like the society itself, was changing rapidly in the late 1960s. Some of what Hofstadter did, studying the political ideas of elites, was coming under criticism by practitioners of what was then called the new social history. This didn't bother him at all. Hofstadter never tried to mold his students along the lines of his own writings. There was no Hofstadter school of history because he never wanted to create one. Instead, he tried to get us to develop our own arguments with intellectual rigor and stylistic accessibility. One felt that in the 60s, his students influenced him as much as he did us. His book on American violence, edited with his graduate student Mike Wallace, offered a portrait of American society far different from earlier writings emphasizing an overarching consensus. His final book, America at 1750, not fully completed when he died, portrayed a colonial society deeply riven by class and racial inequalities. And it was much influenced by the emerging social history. When those like myself who followed him in studying political culture applied his methods to the Civil War era, Hofstadter had to acknowledge that that titanic struggle did seem to mark a very large exception to the consensus vision. But what I really learned from Hofstadter was the craft of writing, which we've heard a little bit about so far. The details of how you actually try to be a good writer, not just saying be a good writer. How to vary your sentence structure, how to use active verbs, avoiding the passive voice. He said that was the key to good writing. He said, quote, make war on the verb to be. He urged us to become familiar with the thesaurus. Because it has two roots, Latinate and Germanic, he told us, English has more words than any other language. Thus, there's liberty and freedom, which are basically the same, but with slight differences, nuances of difference. Writing means choosing exactly the right word from the plethora of possibilities. And then the greatest lesson of all, which I try to drill into the heads of my own students, 90% of writing is rewriting. In other words, the first draft is simply getting your ideas in order. Then the craft of writing begins. This is actually a liberating doctrine. Don't agonize over the first draft. It'll be imperfect, but you'll improve it later on. But also, don't think you can write something useful the day before it's due. Hofstadter was also, of course, the quintessential public intellectual at a time when Columbia scholars like himself, Lionel Trilling, C. Wright Mills, Daniel Bell, and others actively sought to address a broad public outside the academy and played an important role in political discourse. He told his students that popular history need not be second-rate, that historians have an obligation to escape the ivory tower. He even wrote a US history textbook, The American Republic, something frowned on by many scholars. What the future of the public intellectual may be in an age of Twitter, Facebook, disrespect for expertise, and the wide dissemination of ill-considered or downright erroneous ideas is something I'm sure we will want to discuss this evening.
Thank you so much, Eric. I had nothing like the long and deep connection to Hofstadter that you had, but I did have the privilege of writing a senior thesis under his supervision, and I'm sure I've told you the story before, Eric, but the first time I met with him, he said, just as you reported, you'll never know what you think until you write it down. So don't spend 6 months of research and then write the text. Write every week. And actually, he said, I'd like you to bring me 4 or 5 pages every week, which we can look at, and then you can discard them if you know they're not what you would like in the end. So the next week, I brought him my 4 or 5 pages, and he proceeded to take them from me and started reading back aloud. And after about 2 sentences, he took off his reading specs and looked at me and said, surely, Mr. Katznelson, there must be a more felicitous way to make that point. And I've heard that sentence ever since. It's a persisting challenge, which most of us can't live up to as compared to his extraordinary capacity to write. I do want to raise 2 or 3 questions for our consideration. One has to do with what might be called Hofstadter's political liberalism. Some who've written about Hofstadter, including a recent review in The Nation, contrast his 1960s, quote, liberalism to his earlier radicalism. And that's both right and wrong, in my view. And let me state a position and see what you would say. I read Hofstadter as passionately committed to political liberalism, that is, to regimes based on rule of law, government by consent, individual and collective rights, free expression, obviously, and so on. But Hofstadter never was other than also a deep critic of the lived American liberalism. That is, there's no contradiction in Hofstadter. There's a tension, but not a deep contradiction between appreciation, backing, fighting for this kind of the best in this kind of regime. I think of his essay in the book on the founders and constitutionalism. He very much admired how they established a certain kind of government. At the same time, even in the moment of the quasi-radical moment of the American political tradition, which is identified with a certain kind of consensus history, when he wrote about, in a footnote in the Progressive Historians volume, he says, "I was never a consensus historian. I only treat the frame within which conflict occurs and within which violations of liberalism occur." And so I wonder if you agree with this reading, that Hofstadter is not radical or liberal, but a kind of radical liberal, a radical in the sense of pushing political liberalism, but deeply ready to underscore its failures, its shortcomings, often its ugliness, including the paranoid style. Sean, what is that?
I couldn't put it better. I think that he's a critic. He's a liberal with a radical's criticism of liberalism, always. And, you know, to see him as one or the other, I think, is a mistake. I mean, one thing to remember, though, and Eric was getting at this when he was talking about his later work, Hofstadter never stood still. I mean, to try to say that he was one thing at any one point misses the fact that he's a very vibrant intellectual. All of this stuff is cooking within him. And at any one point, some shading might seem to be more apparent than others, but it's not the totality of what's going on inside his brain. And by the time you get to, say, you know, American Violence and America 1750, that's the same man who was writing American political tradition. It's just that he has changed. He has moved. He's a living intellect. He's not a position. He's not a position. He's a living mind. And I think that's always important to recognize about him. As for the American political tradition, I mean, that's a deep criticism of American politics. I mean, the only person in that book, the only chapter in that book of someone who breaks outside of the idea about private property is Wendell Phillips. And, you know, it's the radical that's the hero of that book, if there is a hero in that book. And yet, at every point along the way, he makes it clear how much he honors and respects, even though he's criticizing. At the end of the chapter on the framers, or the founding fathers, the very first chapter, it's very critical, but then it comes around and sees the value in it. That's Hofstadter's genius, is the ability to see things from both sides and to understand them. His commitments are very strong. He is an absolute liberal, even left liberal, but he doesn't want to stand pat. He thinks that any politics will die if it goes uncriticized. That smugness is the enemy of freedom, in a sense. Certainly the enemy of good politics. And I think that showed up in his work.
Eric or Arlie, you want to jump in?
You know, I think I agree with what both of you have said. Hofstadter, of course, did evolve, even though certain themes remain constant. But I think one of the things that did change, whether this is a declension or just wisdom or what, he became more and more alienated, so to speak, from politics, at least as politics was being practiced in the United States. It's not really a story of, you know, a kind of cliched story of a person being young, radical when they're young, and then getting conservative when they're older or something like that. But I think he did have greater hopes in the late 30s, 40s for popular politics producing change in the United States than he would have later on. He became very suspicious of popular, well, what we do in irrationality, enthusiasm. One of the things that's hard for us, I think, to fathom, if you even know anything about him, is the great enthusiasm for Adlai Stevenson.
Right.
This generation, not just Hofstadter, but all sorts of intellectuals had. You know, looking back, Stevenson seems like a pretty milquetoast sort of liberal, really totally indifferent to the issue of race at that time. I mean, he put a Southern segregationist, John Sparkman, on his ticket for vice president without batting an eyelash. And yet the people like Hofstadter and others thought Stevenson was going to bring intellectual life and rigor into national politics, which of course, he didn't do very well in terms of the electoral outcome, Stevenson anyway. But after that, I think that was a turning point in Hofstadter's thinking about popular democracy in a way, or at least it alerted him to the notion, which he wrote in many places, you know, a number of times in different things, that there was really no place for intellectuals like him in the political world. Not that he therefore thought they should ignore the political world, but there were people like him, there just wasn't a place in politics. He was very bemused by people like Arthur Schlesinger, who got into politics, right, you know, feet first. Hofstadter, I remember Hofstadter saying he thought that was a mistake, so to speak. But anyway, yeah, I think the critique of liberalism, though, is always there, as you said, even though he is a bona fide liberal, no question about it.
I've sometimes
to you from the perspective of an ethnographer who's inspired by Hofstadter, and you're also a person with your own deep political conviction. How do you read Hofstadter as views on these matters?
Well, I'm very interested in what Eric was just saying, and yes, I celebrate Hofstadter's capacity to hold ambivalence, right? To both believe in something, but hold a clear capacity to criticize it, to analyze it, to critique it. And as an ethnographer, I kind of look for that capacity in the person I'm trying to understand. And sometimes I get it, sometimes I don't. But when I'm in the field, I will look at someone's, say, Facebook page, a big Trump person, and that makes them look like they're entirely flat. There's no ambivalence. They're clear-sided. They're on a team, you know. And but then you sit down and you ask, hey, can I see where you went to school? You know, what row did you sit in? The front row. Oh, okay. And in church, you know, where did you sit? And can we visit the graveyard where your kin are buried? And while you're doing that or going fishing, suddenly a capacity for self-criticism does emerge. Not always, but people that you would think are flat sometimes aren't. And that it's a good ethnographic practice to keep an ear open for that capacity to hold two truths at the same time.
I want to take issue with, I can't remember if it was Sean or Eric or both of you who said that anti-intellectualism, the book didn't have a thesis. And I want to argue that it did have a thesis, and a very troubling one for us, as it were, us as a group of university academics, intellectuals. And I'm referring now, I think there's a summary of it on page, if I can read this properly, 457, in which he argues that anti-intellectualism, it's very Tocquevillian, this claim, is deeply embedded in democratic life. That intellectuals, whether we like it or not, are part of an elite. We're not of the people in, he says, in the way in which many others are. That we constitute a kind of elite, like it or not. And that the intellectual class, he writes, whether or not enjoys many of the privileges of an elite, is of necessity an elite in its manner of thinking and functioning. Anti-intellectualism, as I hope my pages have made clear, is founded in the democratic institutions and the egalitarian sentiments of the country. So he's juxtaposing us, as it were, as a class, and he uses talks about intellectuals as a class, as distinct from the people. And what do you make of that? You know, what did you make of that? What would you make of that in Louisiana? Or what do you make of that in Princeton, New Jersey, a town of the people, or the Upper West Side of Manhattan? You know,
Yeah.
do we accept, first of all, would you accept that this is a central axis of the work? And second, how do we judge the claim? How would we interrogate the claim? How would we either justify it or falsify it?
I could speak to interrogating the claim. You know, the people that I've come to know in Louisiana, and now I'm doing more field work in Appalachia, I think there's an ambivalence, strong ambivalence toward the academy. As on the one hand, as we know, a BA, not just some school, but getting a BA is a ticket to higher wages and to newer jobs. So if you don't have a BA, you're pretty much stuck in McDonald's and low-level service jobs. So that increasingly, over the last 15 years, become a slice, BA slices between blue-collar life and white-collar life. And so people I talk to want their kids to get a BA. That's on the one hand. But on the other hand, they dread it, they fear it. I talked to a man the other day, he was a car salesman, and he said, oh, my daughter came home from college and now I'm a racist and now I'm a sexist and now I'm a homophobe. And he had this ho-hum, oh, that's what college does to you. It turns kids against parents, and now it demotes you. In other words, from the older generation's point of view, it's downward mobility in the eyes of their children, not good. And actually, a recent Pew poll found an enormous Democrat-Republican gap of about 30 points as to whether, on the item of whether higher education was a force for good in America. A majority of Republicans thought no, a majority of Democrats thought yes. Well, what's that about? That's the other side of this ambivalence. So I don't think it's a open and shut anti-intellectualism, and people I'm meeting are very curious about things, and they can sift evidence as well as anyone, but there's this dread that it's not just that these academies are citadels and elite, it's that these academies are turning young people against them. That's what they do.
Eric, what do you make of this thesis of Hofstadter?
I think that Hofstadter's definition of intellectuals misses a large number of people who are not university professor type intellectuals or literary, prominent literary people. The kind of people that Gramsci called organic intellectuals, people who are more rooted in the kind of communities that Arlie is studying and yet have intellectual interests, maybe more self-educated. I think that, it's a brilliant book, and certainly he identifies a major strand in American thinking, but I think it misses other strands which are also out there. I think people, I'm not a researcher like Arlie, but I do my own unscientific research in the little town where my wife and I have a house up in near the Berkshires. And I think people there have a very mixed feeling toward intellectuals. It's both a wonder, well, what do you do all day, actually? You know, you sit around, what are you doing? You know, don't seem to be earning a living particularly. But on the other hand, they have respect. They have respect for people who are educated. They have respect for people who seem to know a lot about the world, you know, even if they may not agree with what you think. So I think the book is lacking in nuance in a certain way. And I think a lot of it is very personal to Hofstadter. As I say, it comes out of this sense that there is no place for him in American political life. He wrote that after he left the Communist Party in the late 30s. He was only in it briefly. He wrote to someone, you know, well, Harvey Swados, I guess. You know, we don't have a place. We don't have a place. I can't be a communist. On the other hand, I don't want to just stand up for the capitalist system. There's no, you know, there's no place for people with independent minds and thinking in American politics. Yeah, Tocqueville said this much the same in his own language, as Ira pointed out. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I'm just a little, it's hard to say at this moment in American history, but I'm more optimistic about the possibilities of democratic politics, small d, democratic politics in this country than Hofstadter was at the time he was writing the works that are in this very fine volume.
Sean?
As the person who made the point about the no thesis, I think you're right. There is a thesis that on page 457. I'm not sure it required 450 pages to get there. It's a rather sprawling book is what I'm saying. But on the question, I mean, I've sometimes thought, Eric and Arlie, but I've sometimes thought that Anti-Intellectualism in American Life was a very long book of Hofstadter trying to explain why the American people did not elect Adlai Stevenson in 1952 or 1956 for that matter, right? You know, it was like a great betrayal of everything. How could they not? The doofiness of Dwight Eisenhower compared to the great, okay, a somewhat, shall we say, overinflated view of Adlai Stevenson, to be sure. But nevertheless, he was a man of wit, a man of polish, a man of all of those things that somehow would carry on the New Deal, right? He thought of him as a logical successor. All came undone. And I think that you're right. I think he felt personally displaced. I also think he felt politically displaced. He didn't know where to go after Stevenson, right? But this is where I think the question of democracy is important, Ira, and I think you've put your finger on it. But there is, throughout the book, there's a constant reminder that the problems of the attack on ideas is embedded in democracy. You know, that it's there. The egalitarian spirit runs against, you know, people of ideas up there, especially in the academy, especially that class. But that in itself is not the entirety of Hofstadter's view, because he still sees, I think, a great deal of value in democratic politics. And you see that in the way that he turns in 1964. I mean, one of the reasons I included in the book all of those essays about Goldwater, and amazingly, it doesn't get repetitive. Each essay has a different angle on Goldwater. But he sees American democracy in crisis, and he sees American democracy trying to vanquish this threat. And he's standing up. I mean, aside from that thing with when he got in trouble over Stevenson in 1952, he was not a particularly political person in the sense of, you know, unlike Schlesinger, say. Well, Schlesinger's an example on the other extreme. But he was not a person to go out and, you know, write lots of political pieces supporting a candidate. That was not his style. But in 64, he really did. I mean, he was writing piece after piece after piece, not supporting Lyndon Johnson so much as warning about Goldwater's danger to democracy. So I think in the end, it's more an ambivalence vis-a-vis the possibility of ideas. But there he was, bringing ideas to bear against this crazy, you know, paranoid right-wing threat. So I would want to bring that in, and this is, again, talk about history, evolution. This is very much a part of what Hofstadter was. It's not that he suddenly awoke to this. It was there all along. It's just that it was a different moment.
So one sees in this writing on Goldwater, but also in other writings of his, including his much contested work on populism, a concern for democracy, liberal democracy, danger from above and from below. The from above is a kind of demagogic a mobilization, conspiratorial, etc. And from below, a kind of politics of resentment that can become, especially when misled, can become ugly. And I wanted to, we don't have a lot of time left. I wanted to close with a discussion about connecting in, as it were, as Hofstadter urges us to, the then and the now. And let me put a proposition on the table about current resentments, which obviously the President of the United States works very hard to mobilize. Just watch, subject yourself to any single rally of his. You'll see the mobilization of resentment, ressentiment, as Max Scheler once put it, as a theme. But if we compare the moment when Goldwater was running and when Hofstadter was writing in the early to mid 1960s to today, I think one can observe 4 large structural changes. And I'm wondering how each of you thinks they affect the current paranoid style in American politics. One large change has to do with the role of the South in America. This is a passion of mine, but the early 1960s, we still had not had the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and the Paranoid Style was published the same year as the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And we know that Hofstadter, who marched from Selma to Montgomery, was passionate about civil rights. The South at that moment, when he was doing his writing, was safely Jim Crow Democratic. It was half the Democratic Party. He had there's a marvelous essay, I'm sure will appear in volume 1, as it were, Hofstadter, from Calhoun to Dixiecrats, a 1947 essay, or 48, really brilliant essay. But what we've seen in the period since the mid 1960s, in part is the product both of the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and the Goldwater opposition to the Civil Rights Act, as well as soon after Nixon's Southern strategy, was a transformation of a safe Democratic South into a conservative Republican redoubt of the kind that Arlie studied in Louisiana. Second big change, religion. In the mid 1960s, mainstream Protestantism was still dominant in America, and evangelicals had spent 30 years in the wilderness after the Scopes trial. They were very powerful and present in the Bryan campaigns and in the Democratic Party, but they pushed themselves and were pushed aside, and they're back. Not just back, but mainstream Protestantism has had a radical decline as compared to the rise of the evangelical impulse in American Protestantism. Third big change, the radical decline of trade unions. In the early 1960s, still more than 30% of private wage workers belonged to unions. And in some states, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, 70, 80% of wage workers still belong to unions. Today, it's 6% nationally of private wage workers. And last, we've had dramatic demographic change in America as a result of both primarily as a result of the Immigration Act of 1965, just the year he was writing The Paranoid Style. So the sense of loss or dispossession that Arlie reported on in her ethnography, in part has to do with demographic transformation. Do these 4 big changes in regional politics and race, in religion, in unions, and in demography, do they change the story of the paranoid style? Or are we still really, as we read that essay, say that's exactly what we have going for us, alas, now in the Trump presidency, in the Tea Party mobilization, in the new right in America? And if Hofstadter were here, alas, he's not, but we're here with us today, how do you think he'd be commenting on the contemporary, our contemporary, in light of these large-scale, really jumbo transformations in American life? Sean.
First of all, I agree with you, Ira, on the second, third, and fourth of those. I'm not sure I agree about the South, because I think the transformation was already underway. Going back to the Dixiecrats in '48, you could already see it happening. The Goldwater campaign was clearly, anti-civil rights. I think that was already underway. What happened afterwards was a bigger deal, obviously. But I think that was already going on when Hofstadter was writing. What I would sum up, the big difference between us then and now is Ronald Reagan, right in the middle of all of this. I mean, if you talk about all of the things that occurred, the trade unions, the mobilization of the evangelicals, not the immigration part, that's true. He was actually, okay on immigration, right? But in fundamental ways, when Ronald Reagan took power, became president, everything changed in American politics in fundamental ways. The New Deal really was no longer going to be quite having the effervescence that it still sort of did in the 1960s. So I think that politics happens, and politics happened in 1980 in ways that we're still recovering from. But that doesn't mean that the paranoid style is irrelevant or should be changed. It's just that it adapts to changing political circumstances. Just as, when Jedediah Morse was railing against the Bavarian Illuminati in 1798, well, that was a very long time ago, but there's a continuity that you can see there, and so you can see it now.
Arlie, and then Eric.
Yeah, wonderful, Ira and Sean. I like those four factors. I would add one other thing that's changed in our present moment, which is the media as a kind of amplifier is a vehicle through which paranoia can spread. And I would add also that I think we have to put ourselves in the picture. There has been the 60s. There have been universities in coastal cities have incubated new ideas. I mean, transsexual, for example, I hear in a lot of my interviews, oh my goodness, the liberals think there are 70 different genders. How crazy can it get? So that's the media, of course, has put that forward, and this is frightening. There are emotions, I think, that are elicited by all of these factors that Ira has brought out. But one of them is fear. They feel, people I'm talking to, like a new culture has made them strangers to their own land, that they feel culturally colonized, and that the cultural officers, so to speak, in this new cultural colonial office are trained in universities. And I put that as a factor, that there's an opposition to it. They feel marginalized by it. So that too.
Eric, you get the last word.
Oh, great. My last word is addressed to journalists and others. I think many of us, all of us probably have been called by a journalist during this campaign and asked if the paranoid style applies to what's going on today. My last word is to be very careful with that. That term, that slogan, it can easily turn into a kind of a self-fulfilling analysis, whereby it excuses you from looking carefully at the ideas, whether you don't like them or not, the grievances. Arlie is, of course, not guilty of that at all. She's looking very carefully, but it can be a very dismissive term. Once you label this group or that group as part of the paranoid style, there's not much else you have to really say. It psychologizes politics too much, in my opinion. The things that Ira mentioned, which are all, of course, very important, are kind of structural features of the society and the polity and the economy. Paranoia exists at a different level, so to speak. Irrationality is driving politics in that sense, and I think the concept has value. It did run Hofstadter occasionally into trouble, as Ira mentioned. I think his view of the populists is now considered quite limited or misleading in some ways. So I would just be, I would be careful if in just using the notion of the paranoid style as a kind of way to dismiss groups that one doesn't feel sympathy for. That's all.
If I may be allowed one final thought, the way in which I think Hofstadter brilliantly connected structure and behavior was to look at a kind of a relationship, a mediating relationship of what I would call the relationship of experience and dispositions. Structures generate possible experiences. And not all of us experience the same structure the same way. He was very interested, whether it's the populists or the Goldwater followers or others, in how persons experience the structural world. He didn't write about structure as such. He wrote about experience and more important, how people made sense of that experience, how they formed dispositions to interpret those experiences, or had those dispositions given to them, as the Goldwater campaign did, in the way it framed reality so as to mobilize existing resentment. And it's this pairing of experience and disposition, both of which are very complex realities, that I think where the power of the analysis lies as you read and reread these chapters. Very final thing I want to say before turning us back to Max is it's really hard to pick up historians who have not been with us since the early 1970s, 1970 precisely. We're talking about a half century has passed. When Eric, when you and I were undergraduates and read Turner, Beard, and Harrington, I think they felt much more old-fashioned than, even though we may have liked their elite versus mass, you know, the struggle kind of thing, seem more archaic somehow than Richard Hofstadter does to us today. This is a kind of a very rare, powerful, enduring set of works with which to grapple. And therefore, I want to close my remarks with renewed thanks to Sean and to the Library of America for giving us a fresh chance to see Hofstadter, not just the famous big works or the essays, but also some of the unpublished ones or not well-known ones. And read whole, we get a picture of a creative, fertile, endlessly questing mind at work to make sense of reality now in deep connection with the longer run and the fundamentals of the American experience. And that's quite something. It remains quite something. Max, you get the last word.
Thank you very much, Ira, and thank you to all the panelists for a really fascinating, engaging discussion. You've been listening to Sean Wilentz, Arlie Hochschild, Eric Foner, and Ira Katznelson discuss the enduring relevance of Richard Hofstadter. His writings from the 1950s and 60s, edited by Sean Wilentz, are now available in the Library of America series. I hope you'll join us for forthcoming online events from Library of America. On Thursday, October 29th, it's Shirley Jackson, A Rather Haunted Life, a pre-Halloween conversation with Ruth Franklin and Francine Prose about one of our most scintillatingly chilling writers. Details about this and other upcoming LOA Live events can be found on our website, loa.org, where you'll also find information about Library of America's Richard Hofstadter and Shirley Jackson editions and links to purchase those and other volumes of Great American Writing. You'll also find recordings of tonight's and previous LOA Live events. Thanks so much again to our panelists, to Casey Blake and Columbia's Center for American Studies for co-hosting tonight, and please have a great evening.